I always thought my life with Clara was a quiet masterpiece, painted in muted tones of routine and trust. 20 years married, 3 kids grown and off to college, and a house in the suburbs that hummed with the soft rhythm of our shared existence. She was a librarian, her days spent among dusty shelves and whispered conversations, while I managed a small hardware store downtown. We weren't flashy people. Our evenings were spent with herbal tea and documentaries, her glasses slipping down her nose as she scribbled notes about obscure historical figures. I loved her quirks, her oddities, the way she'd hum off-key to jazz records on Sundays. That's why the unraveling, when it came, felt like a sledgehammer to a glass figurine I'd spent decades polishing. It started with a phone call I wasn't meant to hear. I'd come home early. Rain had slowed business at the store, and found her in the kitchen, her back to me, voice low and threaded with something I couldn't place. Laughter, maybe, but sharper, like a blade catching light. "Tomorrow, then," she murmured. "By the fountain." She hung up quick when she saw me, her smile too wide, too brittle. "Just a friend from work," she said, brushing past me to fuss with the kettle. I nodded, but the air felt wrong, like a room after someone's left it. A faint echo of absence. That night I couldn't sleep. Her breathing beside me was steady, but I kept replaying that call, the way her fingers had tightened on the phone. I slipped out of bed and checked her cell, something I'd never done before. The history was wiped clean, not a single call logged. My stomach twisted. Clara wasn't tech-savvy. She still asked me to fix the printer every other week. So this wasn't forgetfulness. It was intent. I sat in the dark, staring at her sleeping form, wondering who my wife had become. The next day I followed her. I called in sick, parked 2 blocks from the library, and waited. She emerged at noon, her usual cardigan swapped for a scarf I didn't recognize, bright red and fluttering like a warning flag. She walked with purpose, not to the sandwich shop she favored for lunch, but to the park 3 streets over. There, by the fountain, stood a man I knew instantly, Greg Hammond, our kid's old soccer coach. Tall, wiry, with a grin that had always seemed too eager. They didn't hug. They just stood close, heads bent together, her hand brushing his arm like it belonged there. I watched from the car, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, as something inside me began to crack. I didn't confront her that day. I drove home, hands shaking, and poured myself a whiskey, something I hadn't touched since my brother's wedding a decade ago. The burn of it steadied me, gave me a tether to hold while my mind spun. Greg Hammond. He'd been around years ago, shouting encouragements from the sidelines while our twins, Ellie and Max, chased a ball across muddy fields. Clara had volunteered as team mom back then, hauling coolers of sliced oranges and laughing at his dumb jokes. I'd thought nothing of it. He was a fixture, like the chipped bleachers or the whistle's shrill cry. But now, every memory felt tainted, a Polaroid dipped in acid. I started digging, subtle at first, checking her schedule, noting when she lingered after work. She'd always been predictable, home by 5:30, dinner on by 6. Now, she'd breeze in at 7, cheeks flushed, muttering about book club or inventory. Lies stacked like library cards, and I cataloged them all. I found an old photo album in the attic, from the soccer days, and there they were. Clara and Greg, side by side at a team picnic, her head tilted toward him, his hand on her shoulder. I'd taken the picture, oblivious, grinning behind the lens. The whiskey bottle emptied faster after that. 2 weeks later, I tailed her again. This time, they met at a diner on the edge of town, a greasy spoon we'd never visited together. Through the window, I saw them share a booth, her foot nudging his under the table, his fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. It wasn't just closeness, it was intimacy, a language I didn't speak with her anymore. I snapped photos with my phone, blurry but damning, my breath fogging the car window. When she came home that night, humming that off-key tune, I asked how her day was. "Quiet," she said, kissing my cheek. I tasted the lie on her lips. That's when I knew it wasn't fleeting. This wasn't a stumble, a moment of weakness. It was a betrayal carved deep, deliberate. a second life she'd built while I fixed leaky faucets and mowed our lawn. I lay awake plotting, not revenge yet, just understanding. I needed proof, something undeniable, before I could let the rage loose. So I bought a tiny recorder, the kind hunters use for wildlife, and hid it in her purse. Invasive, sure, but trust was ash now, and I was sifting through it for answers. The recorder caught gold or poison depending on how you look at it. I listened in the garage, door locked, headphones on. The world narrowed to her voice and his. They met at a motel, the Blue Haven, a rundown place off Route 12 with peeling paint and a neon sign that flickered like a dying pulse. "You're sure he doesn't suspect?" Greg's voice, low and smug, crackled through the static. "He's too busy with his hammers and nails," Clara replied, laughing. A sound I'd once cherished, now a dagger twisting in my gut. They murmured plans, touches I couldn't see but could feel through the audio, a choreography of deceit. She told me she was visiting her sister that weekend. Instead, she'd packed a bag. Lingerie I'd never seen, perfume I didn't buy, and driven to him. The recorder ran out of battery mid-conversation, but I had enough. Dates, times, a map of her duplicity. I played it again, then again, until their voices echoed in my skull like a stuck record. My wife, my Clara, had hollowed out our marriage and filled it with this. A cheap motel room and a man who'd once handed out juice boxes to our kids. I didn't cry. I'd expected tears, but what came was colder, a clarity that settled like frost. I started researching Greg. Social media gave me his life in snapshots. Divorced, living alone in a condo downtown, a part-time gig at a gym now that coaching was behind him. Ordinary, unremarkable, except for the way he'd burrowed into my world. I wondered how long it had been. Months? Years? Had he been there at our anniversary dinners, smirking behind a glass of cheap wine while I toasted her? I followed him next. He didn't notice my truck trailing his beat-up sedan. I learned his routines. Coffee at 8, gym by 10, evenings at a bar called Rusty's. Once, I stood 10 feet from him, watching him flirt with the bartender, his laugh grating against my nerves. I imagined confronting him, but that wasn't the plan. Not yet. Revenge needed roots, and I was still planting. Clara noticed the shift in me, though I hid it well, or so I thought. "You're quiet lately," she said one night, stirring soup on the stove, her back to me like that first phone call. I shrugged, said work was tiring, and she let it drop. But her eyes lingered, searching, and I wondered if she sensed the storm brewing. I'd stopped touching her, not out of disgust but calculation. Every brush of her hand felt like a transaction now, a down payment on the lie she lived. I needed distance to see her clearly, to plan. The recordings piled up. 3 more meetings, each a variation on the same theme. Motel rooms, stolen hours, her voice softening for him in ways it hadn't for me in years. I transcribed them, late at night in the garage, my handwriting jagged from exhaustion and fury. One line stuck. "You make me feel alive again." Alive. As if I'd buried her in our life. As if 2 decades of stability were a coffin she'd escaped. I stared at that word, alive, until it blurred on the page. I hired a private investigator. A wiry guy named Paul with a smoker's rasp and no questions. Cash up front, results in a week. He delivered. Photos of them tangled in a car, receipts from the motel, even a grainy shot of her slipping Greg a key. Our house key, I realized, recognizing the goofy keychain Ellie had made in 5th grade. They'd been here, in my home, while I was at the store counting screws. The violation sank deep, a splinter under a nail, and I started sketching the edges of something cruel. Paul asked if I wanted more bank records, phone taps. I said no. I had enough to build on. The revenge wasn't about exposure yet. It was about dismantling her world as methodically as she'd dismantled mine. I bought a second phone, untraceable, and began making calls, not to lawyers but to people who knew people. Old high school buddies with rough edges, a cousin who'd done time. I wasn't sure what I'd ask of them, but the net was forming. The plan crystallized on a Tuesday, rain drumming the roof as I sat in the garage, surrounded by tools and transcripts. It wasn't enough to leave her, to walk away with half our savings and a bitter divorce. She'd taken something intangible, my faith in us, in her, and given it to him. I wanted her to feel that loss, magnified, a mirror held to her betrayal. And Greg? He'd pay too, not for loving her, but for smirking through it, for thinking me a fool. I started with the house. She'd always loved it, our forever home, she'd called it, with its creaky porch and the garden she tended like a child. I contacted a realtor, posed as a curious seller, and got an appraisal. Then, using the second phone, I listed it online, dirt cheap, under a fake name. Offers rolled in within hours. I picked one, a young couple, cash in hand, and set a closing date for 2 weeks out. Clara didn't know, of course. I forged her signature on the paperwork, a skill I'd never imagined needing, and smiled at the irony of her own secrecy teaching me how. Next, Greg. His condo was his pride, a bachelor pad he'd bragged about on social media. I drove by at night, noting the security, lax, a single lock and a camera that didn't blink. I didn't break in, not yet, but I left a gift. A brick through his windshield, unsigned, untraceable. Let him wonder, let him sweat. I watched from across the street as he stumbled out in boxers, cursing the rain, and felt the first flicker of satisfaction. Clara came home that night, oblivious, chattering about a new book shipment. I nodded, poured her tea, and asked about her day. Fine, she said, sipping her scarf. That red scarf, draped over the chair. I pictured it tightening around her neck, then pushed the thought down. Not yet. The cruelty would come slow, a symphony building to its climax. She'd built her betrayal brick by brick. I'd tear it down the same way. The house sale moved faster than I'd expected. The couple wired the deposit, and I met them at a notary's office downtown, posing as both seller and spouse with a stack of forged papers. Clara's signature was easy to mimic. Years of watching her sign grocery lists and birthday cards had burned it into my muscle memory. The buyers, giddy and clueless, shook my hand and promised to keep the garden alive. I smiled, imagining her face when she found out her sanctuary was gone. The closing was set for Friday, 2 days away, and I hadn't told her a thing. She'd been too busy weaving her web with Greg to notice me unraveling ours. That night, I escalated with Greg. The brick had been a warning shot. Now I aimed closer. I'd learned his gym schedule. 10 a.m., like clockwork, so I waited in the parking lot, hood up, hands steady. When he parked his sedan, I slipped a tracker under the wheel well, a cheap thing I'd ordered online. It synced to my second phone, a blinking dot mapping his every move. By noon, he was at the motel, and I knew she was with him. Her car was missing from the library lot when I drove by. The tracker confirmed it, a digital tether to their betrayal. I didn't stop there. Revenge was a hunger now, gnawing at me, and I fed it with precision. I called the gym, anonymous, and reported a theft, Greg's name, his locker number, a fabricated story about missing cash. They wouldn't find anything, but the suspicion would cling to him, a stain he couldn't scrub off. I pictured him stammering to his boss, that smug grin faltering, and it fueled me. Back home, I rifled through Clara's purse while she showered, finding a motel receipt she'd forgotten to toss. Blue Haven, room 12. The carelessness of it stung. She didn't even bother hiding anymore. Friday came and the house was sold. The notary handed me a check, half the value of our life together, cashed out in secret, and I deposited it into a new account she'd never touch. Clara was at book club when the deed transferred, and I spent the afternoon emptying the garage of my tools, my sanctuary, loading them into a rented storage unit. She'd come home to a shell, but not yet. I'd let her sleep in her delusion one more night. The cruelty was in the timing, the slow bleed before the wound gaped open. Saturday morning, I woke before her, brewed coffee, and watched her shuffle into the kitchen, oblivious to the guillotine I'd hung above her head. "You're up early," she said, yawning. That red scarf looped around her neck like a noose she didn't see. I nodded, sipping my mug, and asked if she had plans. "Just errands," she lied, her eyes darting to her phone. I knew where she'd go. Greg's dot had parked at the motel an hour ago, waiting. I let her leave, then followed at a distance, the tracker guiding me like a bloodhound. She didn't go to the motel. Instead, she pulled into a florist, emerged with a bouquet, lilies, her favorite, and drove to Greg's condo. I parked a block away, watching through binoculars as she knocked, then slipped inside with that key she'd given him. My key. The flowers were a gut punch, our anniversary tradition, now his. I sat there, engine idling, as the tracker's dot mocked me from my phone. They were together in his bed. I knew it, and the image seared itself into my brain, a brand I'd carry until I repaid it. That afternoon, I struck again. Greg's condo had a maintenance line. I'd found it online, so I called, voice disguised with a towel over the receiver, and reported a gas leak. Within an hour, a truck rolled up, and I watched from my vantage point as he and Clara stumbled out, her hair mussed, his shirt half-buttoned. The texts swarmed in, and I saw her panic, clutching that scarf like a lifeline. No leak, of course, but the disruption was enough. Greg yelling at the crew, her retreating to her car. I smiled, small and cold, and drove away. Back home, I planted seeds for her undoing. I kept her library schedule memorized, so I called her boss, feigning concern. She's been distracted lately? I said. Forgetting things. Might be stress. The seed was subtle, but it'd grow, doubt in her competence. A crack in her perfect facade. She came home late, flustered, muttering about a mix-up, and I offered her tea, my face a mask of care. The house keys sat heavy in my pocket. The new owners sat waiting to take over. Sunday, I let the hammer fall on the house. Clara was out, another errand, and the new owners arrived with a moving truck, eager to claim their bargain. I told them we were relocating. A story they swallowed whole. I handed over the keys, watched them unpack boxes, and drove away as their kids ran across the lawn. Our lawn, hers. The check was safe in my account, and I'd moved my clothes to the storage unit overnight. When she got home, she'd find strangers in her kitchen, her garden theirs, her life erased. I didn't wait to see it. I tracked Greg instead, his dots circling the bar, Rusty's. Liquid courage, maybe after yesterday's chaos. I parked nearby, slipped into a booth, and watched him drink alone, his face tight with worry. Good. I'd mailed photos to his ex-wife that morning, the motel shots from Paul, stamped with dates, hinting he'd cheated during their marriage too. A lie, maybe, but plausible enough to drag him into a legal mess. He ordered another beer, oblivious to the noose tightening. Clara called me then, voice shrill through the phone. Where are you? There's people in our house. I feigned shock, said I'd lost my job, sold it to save us, and hung up before she could scream. Let her stew, let her scramble. I pictured her standing on the porch, that scarf flapping in the wind, as strangers told her to leave. The recorder in her purse, still active, would catch it all, her unraveling my symphony now. That night, I slept in a motel. Not the Blue Haven, never there. My phone buzzing with her missed calls. I didn't answer. The plan was rolling, unstoppable, and I savored the weight of it. Greg's turn was next, a deeper cut, but Clara's shock was the appetizer, bitter and sharp on my tongue. Monday, I turned the screws on Greg. His tracker showed him at the gym, so I called the cops. Anonymous, a burner phone, and reported a fight in the parking lot, his car described down to the dented fender. I watched from a distance as sirens wailed in, officers swarming him as he stepped out, sweaty and confused. He argued, hands flailing, but they cuffed him anyway, a misunderstanding that'd stick to his record like tar. I'd paid a kid from the bar to back the story, $50 for a lie, and it worked. Greg's smugness was crumbling, brick by brick. Clara's calls stopped, replaced by texts, pleading, then furious. How could you? She wrote, as if she held the moral high ground. I didn't reply. The recorder caught her with Greg later, her voice raw. He's lost it, sold everything. I don't know what to do. His response was a grunt, distracted, already pulling away. I grinned, hearing the fracture. She'd leaned on him and he was buckling, perfect. I hit her job next. I'd kept Paul on retainer, and he delivered a package to the library. Forged complaints, backdated, claiming she'd mishandled funds. Nothing huge, just enough to trigger an audit. Her boss, already primed by my call, wouldn't fire her outright, but the scrutiny would grind her down, her sanctuary tainted. She loved that job, its quiet order. Now it'd be chaos, a mirror to her life. I checked into a new motel, paid cash, and reviewed the pieces. House gone, Greg flailing, her career teetering. The cruelty was in the layers. Each loss a note in a dirge she didn't see coming. I slept soundly, dreaming of her tears. Tuesday, I went nuclear on Greg. His condo was the target, his last bastion. So I hired a guy from my cousin's crew, a wiry ex-con named Mick with a talent for locks. I didn't ask how he did it. I just gave him the address and a list. Flood the place, ruin everything, leave no trace. By evening, Greg's raced home from the bar, and I drove by later to see the aftermath. Water pouring from his windows, furniture soaked, his life a swamp. Mick texted, "Done. Smells like regret now." I tipped him double. Clara showed up at my store that day, eyes red, scarf gone. "We need to talk," she said, voice trembling. I locked the door, let her in, and listened as she begged house, money, me, all of it. "I made a mistake," she whispered, reaching for my hand. I pulled back, cold, and told her the truth. "You made a choice." Her face crumpled, and I saw Greg in her desperation, the life she'd chased dissolving. I didn't mention the sale, the recordings, just let her drown in the unknown. That night, I played the latest tape, her sobbing to Greg, his curt, "I can't deal with this." The split was starting, her anchor slipping. I leaned back, plotting the finale. She'd lose him too, and then I'd twist the knife deeper. The revenge was a living thing now, breathing through me, and I fed it with every move. Wednesday morning, I turned my attention to Clara's last refuge, her family. She'd always been close to her sister, Diane, a prim woman who judged me quietly for years. Diane lived an hour away, and I knew Clara had run to her after the house was lost. Her texts hinted at it, a desperate staying with Dee for a bit. I drove there not to confront, but to sow. Diane's husband, Tom, was a soft-spoken accountant who liked his whiskey too much. I met him at a bar near their place, bought him around and spun a tale. Clara's breakdown, her affair with Greg, how she dragged us all into her mess. I showed him a photo. Motel, her and Greg, time-stamped, and watched his face harden. Tom didn't need much prodding. By the third drink, he was ranting about Diane, always cleaning up Clara's messes. I left him stewing, knowing he'd take it home. Sure enough, the recorder in Clara's purse, still active, bless her carelessness. Caught the fallout that night. Diane's voice sharp. "You've humiliated him, us." Tom's furious. "You can't stay." Clara's sobs filled the static, a broken, "I didn't mean to." And I pictured her alone on their couch, scarfless, shrinking. Her family, her safety net, was gone now, snipped by my hand through Tom's liquor-loosened tongue. Greg, meanwhile, was a mess. The tracker showed him circling town, bar, gym, condo, his life a soggy ruin. I upped the ante, mailing his boss at the gym a tip. Check his record, recent arrest. The fight I'd staged would surface, and with it, whispers of theft from my earlier call. He'd lose that job soon, a domino I'd nudged into falling. I watched him from Rusty's that night, slumped over a beer, and felt the satisfaction coil tighter. He wasn't smirking now. Clara called again, voicemail this time. "Please, I'll do anything, come back." I deleted it. The end was near, and I was savoring the buildup. Thursday, I dismantled her social world. Clara had a tight circle, book club ladies, library regulars, moms from the soccer days. I'd always been the quiet husband in the background, but now I stepped forward. I emailed them all from a burner account, a group blast titled "Truth About Clara." Attached were snippets, recordings edited for maximum sting, her laughing with Greg, mocking our dull life, photos of the motel key. I didn't sign it, didn't need to. The gossip would spread like wildfire, her reputation ash by morning. I tested it at the store. One of her friends, Linda, came in for paint, her eyes avoiding mine. "Heard about the house?" she mumbled, then left quick. The silence said it all. They'd seen, they knew, they judged. Clara's phone buzzed nonstop that day. She'd left it on the counter when she stormed into the store earlier, and the recorder caught her unraveling. "They won't talk to me? Greg, what's happening?" His reply was curt. "Handle it yourself." The fracture widened, and I leaned into it. Greg's job was gone by noon. I'd called the gym, posing as a client, asking about that guy with the record. The manager's stammer confirmed it. I drove by his condo, saw a for sale sign slapped up. Water damage too costly to fix. He was sinking and I was the weight. That night, I mailed Clara's scarf, red, crumpled, to his place with a note. "She's yours now. Let him choke on the symbolism." I slept in the storage unit, surrounded by my tools, the check from the house warming my pocket. The endgame was close. Friday, I broke Greg completely. He'd moved to a cheap motel. Not the Blue Haven, another dive. His dot stagnant there all morning. I hired Mick again, this time to plant something. A baggie of pills slipped into Greg's car through a cracked window. Then a tip to the cops' drug activity, his license plate, a concerned citizen. I watched from a diner across the street as they rolled in, lights flashing, and hauled him out in cuffs. Possession, maybe intent to sell, he'd fight it, but the stain would stick. His ex-wife's lawyer would pounce, his life a legal quagmire now. Clara showed up at the store again, haggard, eyes sunken. "You did this?" she whispered, clutching a printout of the email I'd sent her friends. I didn't deny it, just stared until she backed away, trembling. The recorder caught her calling Greg after, his voice a snarl through the line. "I'm done, Clara. Your mess got me arrested." She begged. He hung up, and the silence that followed was her world collapsing. I'd stripped her lover, her home, her family, her friends. Now I'd take her pride. I contacted her library, left a voicemail for the board, checked the audit. She's been skimming. The complaints Paul forged would back it, and her job, her last anchor, would slip away. She'd be alone, exposed, a pariah in the life she'd built. I packed the last of my things, ready to vanish, but not before the final stroke. That night, I dreamed of her standing in the rain, flowers wilting in her hands, and woke smiling. Saturday, I staged the finale. Clara's car was parked at Diane's. She'd gone back, maybe to beg again, so I drove there, waited until she left for groceries. I slipped into the back seat, left a package. The recorder, every tape transcribed, a note in my handwriting. "You thought I wouldn't see." She'd find it, play it, relive every whisper she'd shared with Greg, every lie she'd fed me. The cruelty wasn't just the evidence. It was the mirror, forcing her to face herself. Greg's arrest hit the local news, small blurb, big shame. I mailed copies to his neighbors, his gym buddies, a final twist of the knife. He'd rot in that cell or out of it, a shell of the man who'd grinned at my wife. I checked my account. The house money sat fat and untouchable, and booked a flight. Not far, just far enough to start over. A coastal town where no one knew my name. Clara called one last time, voice hoarse. "I'm sorry, please." I cut her off, said, "Live with it," and hung up. The recorder's last file, uploaded to my phone, was her sobbing alone in her car, the package open beside her. I listened once, then deleted it. She'd have nothing left. No home, no job, no Greg, no me. Just the echo of her choices. I drove to the airport, the storage unit emptied, my old life a husk. Revenge wasn't loud. It was this, methodical, silent, a glacier crushing everything she loved. Sunday, I landed in my new town, a salty breeze washing away the last of her scent. The house money bought a cabin, small but mine, overlooking waves that didn't care about Clara or Greg. I unpacked my tools, set up a workshop, and let the rhythm of saws and hammers drown the past. No one here knew me as the betrayed husband, just a quiet man with steady hands. Clara's library fired her that week. Paul texted the update, a final favor. Greg's court date loomed, his condo sold at a loss, his name mud. She'd called Diane, The tape caught it. I've lost everything. And Diane's cold. You did this. The family bridge was ash now, her isolation complete. I pictured her in a rented room, scarf gone, Lily's dead, staring at walls that didn't answer. I didn't gloat. The revenge was done. A machine I'd built and dismantled. Its purpose served. I walked the beach that night, the tide erasing my footprints, and felt light. Not happy, not yet, but unburdened. She'd chased alive with him. I'd buried them both in it. The cruelty was hers to carry now, a shadow she'd never outrun.